You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
The logic and clarity of the scientific method, objective observation, testing hypotheses, critical analysis, and the like, are compelling for their elegance, simplicity, and power. Doing science, however, is more often than not a somewhat messy undertaking that involves establishing protocols for conducting experiments or carrying out observations, recording and maintaining records, an extraordinary array of types of evidence, images of all kinds, and readings from a plethora of devices used in research. Data, as such, contribute to making the doing of science a less than tidy enterprise. And if someone else is paying for the doing of science, they want to know how their money is being spent. And so someone on the research team must somehow account for how his or her colleagues are using time on the university's MRI, purchasing chemicals, replacing filters, and the like. It's not exactly a thrilling part of doing science, but it's generally necessary. The messiness of doing science also stems from the fact that science is inherently a very human, collective undertaking, even in the case of a single researcher. As the noted ecologist Paul Sears observed nearly 80 years ago, if science is not a social phenomenon, it is nothing. And said another way, science is a cultural practice, and everything, and I emphasize the word everything, is connected with it, are all products of interactive learning. Doing science entails substantial interaction and communication among researchers. And if you add to this the international nature of the scientific enterprise, you find something really quite complicated. Scientists have long established and used extensively networks of colleagues that transcend national boundaries. And while English is more or less the lingua franca of science, the communication of scientific research nevertheless contributes to the messiness of doing science. And the untidy nature of doing science will not likely disappear anytime soon, although we will have a chance today, later in this interview, to talk a bit about artificial intelligence and its potential. But the process can be improved. Consider the changes underway in healthcare. Early signs are that the diagnosis and treatment of illness and injury have already begun to improve as a result of digitizing medical records and the use of software that integrates the array of patient information as well as the activities of the health professionals who engage with the patient. Something similar is available for researchers doing science, and we sought out someone who can help us to understand such a system. Dr. Klemen Zupancic is CEO of Scinote. Scinote is a digital platform that replaces the traditional lab notebook and integrates virtually the entire spectrum of analytical, administrative, and communication tasks involved in research, whether taking place in academia or in industry. Dr. Zupancic earned his Ph.D. as well as his undergraduate degree from the University of Ljubijana in Slovenia and a second bachelor's from Columbia University in cell and molecular biology. He is co-founder of Biosistemika, a developer of custom software for the life sciences and the pharmaceutical industry. The firm's offices are in Slovenia and the United States. Before turning to business, Dr. Zupancic conducted research on diagnosing cancer and continues to focus on automating key laboratory functions. Dr. Zupancic, welcome to Innovators.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
I'd like to get a sense of how large and important the issues and problems are that you and others are taking on by offering technological solutions. So let me begin by asking if I have done scientists an injustice when I describe the process of doing science as messy. Just how much of a problem is it that you and others have taken on with products such as Scinote?
I think messy describes it pretty well. Science has historically been, as you described pretty well in the preface, science has historically been a human undertaking to understand more. And that in this situation, we are typically facing the hypothesis of what we expect the world will be, and then when we try to prove that hypothesis, we learn that the world is much more complex than we've anticipated. So by its nature, that work is going to be messy. I don't think it's the right way to approach this and say, okay, how can we make science less messy? Maybe the right approach is, how can we make sure that science delivers on our expectations at the same time as being messy and allowing for scientists to have the freedom of thought and have the freedom of work. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think we won't be able to escape the messiness of science. I would agree with you completely that there is a lot that can already be done today to improve on how science performs for the expectations that the communities have on the science.
Is it your sense that technology has moved to the point that its capacity for taming the beast, if you will, is sufficient to the task?
Well, partly the technology is the reason for the increased messiness. On one hand, we have now technologies that produce terabytes of data in single experiments, whereas if we go 100 years back, this was not even an option. We would observe things, we would count things. So everything was, particularly from the data standpoint, everything was much more manageable. So there was essentially less mass to begin with. But on the other hand, we have also the technology that can help us cope with this mess today, and where we see a gap, and something that we are trying to contribute as Scinote, as a Scinote company, is to this gap between the technology that's available for the scientists to produce data and conduct experiments, and also technology to capture all the data and help scientists to manage this data, make sense of the data, and make sure that future generation of scientists are able to build upon that data.
Let me turn to something you've written about what I think is the near future of scientific research. And you made a very powerful case that scientific research in the near future will be characterized by the following: even more collaboration among researchers, increasingly connected laboratory devices, now that we hear talk of 5G in particular, greater capacity to analyze the vast amounts of data being produced and available for analysis, outsourcing experiments rather than doing it yourself, largely because the cost of doing experiments for having the capacity to perform those experiments has become just extraordinarily high. And then greater transparency of results from research, because it'll be much easier for those experiments that produce the results that can be replicated without nearly as much trouble as it was in the past. And then finally, the practicality of vast and readily accessible repositories for the research done in a given domain. And I'll use the example of cancer cell behavior. Now, let's for a moment assume those forecasts are spot on. What are the implications of these developments for the sorts of tools and services that will be needed? And what do these forecasts mean for how scientists are even trained?
That's the question, essentially, right? How do we prepare for the future when we don't really have a working solution or an adequate solution today? I will be honest, I don't know the answer. I don't know what the complete answer is that will solve, for all of these problems. However, we can learn a lot from other industries or from other use cases that have gone through the same, let's say, same trends and how they addressed it, and also think, try to break down the problem to individual
manageable tasks.
Exactly, and see what we can do. So a couple of things we can do already now. First of all, we need to all agree that the way we did science until now has to change. So I'll give you a practical example I just had with one of our clients. They installed Scinote for their lab, and after a month or so, they came to us and said, well, we tried Scinote, but nothing has really changed. Scientists are still storing data on their USB sticks on their drives. How is Scinote helping with this? There are a lot of things that software tools can do in this, but in the sense it has to start with having the digital mindset for the future. So it's something that we are putting a lot of effort now into teaching. Let's say really teaching our customers what it is about. Like the customers would decide, okay, I'm ready to make a step into the, let's say, towards the digital science, but it's not, the decision is not enough. You need to make sure that your organization has been, that everybody's on board with that decision, and that you have a strategy how this will happen, because it cannot happen overnight. It's change of habits. So people have to tackle this step by step, make sure that they, that there is some logic behind this, and that there is some guidance and good practices we already know. So it's really one of the first things that we should focus on is changing the mindset and saying, of course it's maybe convenient to store this Excel spreadsheet on a USB stick that I've just generated, but will this be sustainable? Will somebody else, if I leave this organization in 3 months, will somebody else A, have access to this data, and B, will they be able to understand it? So it really starts with us, so us as scientists, understanding that there is more to be done when it comes to data and how it's stored and how it's managed and how it's shared. So that's maybe the first thing that I would say. The other, then there are many, let's say, many different ways of moving things forward, really depending on how does your everyday work look like. We've talked, in the past few years, we talked to a lot of different scientists coming from different fields. It's hard to say, oh, this is a group that does molecular biology, because it's becoming very interdisciplinary and everybody is doing everything. So, but still, on the daily basis, their lives look very different from each other. So it's really up to the scientists to break the problem down and define the bottlenecks. What are we trying to solve first, rather than let's have a complete transformation of the entire organization overnight, because this results in a lot of stress and potentially commitment to either technologies or processes that are not the best suited for what we're trying to do. So really approaching this incrementally is what I would like to stress. But yeah, as you said, like even if not all of these trends go as you presented them, there is a huge discrepancy between what would be an ideal situation of how this is managed versus what's the reality. And when we're talking about academia, one of the points that I would make is that, and that is for sure a contributing factor, is really the increasing pressure to publish for the scientists.
Yes.
It's, in the end, it's all about incentives, and scientists are, in general, they chose their profession because they want to help the society. They are curious. They're not doing this for, for money or whatever. They're doing this because they're curious and they want to see change. They want to see improvements. Their incentive, however, is to publish as many articles as possible, which sometimes, when you are well funded, you can go beyond that. But when you're struggling for funds, when you're struggling for your department, it will incentivize you to be a more sloppy scientist, if you will.
Klemen, is there a reason for a degree of optimism about the next generation of scientists? And by that I mean, if you look at the generation that will come out in the next 5 to 10 years, theirs has always been a digital world. They don't know another world other than a digital one, where a device reads your blood pressure and you routinely communicate with multiple people on multiple sites, on multiple devices. Is there reason to be optimistic that the next generation will come to the whole question of digitizing, if you will, science? They'll come to it with much less stress than what we see with a mature organization?
I absolutely think there is a reason to be optimistic. I think we are moving, not just us, but the entire field is making huge steps toward what we're talking about to become a reality. There is the element of, let's say, generational gap, although I will be honest, it's not really a big one when it comes to science. So what we've seen with our users is that it's not so much about age per se, but it's a lot more about how comfortable are you with making change. Now, that being said, when we come to a point where the entire infrastructure is already set up to be digital in the first place, then the transition is much smoother. So what we see if when we get when we have customers that are new organizations, be it new labs or smaller biotech companies, where they, from the start already plan everything to be digital and go through all of this without even considering the traditional methods. Implementing such systems in such organizations is much more straightforward. Before we get there, and it will realistically take probably about 10 years, before we get there, how do we make sure that science that we do today can live on and can be sustained in the future generations, but at the same time, people that are doing science now, how can we partner with the community or build a community together of people that are aware of the needs that science has?
That to me is the most optimistic I've heard in tackling this issue. Let me turn to a little bit different question. There's an old line about Andy Warhol, I think, who talked about everyone will have 15 minutes of fame. But I think there's a new way of measuring fame. It's when what you're doing gets an acronym. So I can tell that you and Scinote, you're about to sort of take off, because Scinote is now one of a score of electronic laboratory notebooks, and there's so many of them now, and the process is becoming so important that they now refer to them as ELNs. So I just want to assure you, Clemens, you've made it now in the modern world because you have your own acronym. Now, I imagine that's a competitive but somewhat specialized market. So how is the decision made to go to ELNs? Because I imagine it's very different in, say, the academy versus a business. And if you would, can you share with us how you and perhaps even your competitors go about marketing and selling in research laboratories of universities? What are the factors that lead to a decision to implement ELNs in those environments?
So maybe just to make like a differentiation, or maybe just a little bit of history on ELN.
Sure.
Historically, the first industries that started adopting electronic lab notebooks were pharmaceutical industries and diagnostic labs. The reason for this was because the workflows of what they were doing were very standardized. If you think of a diagnostic lab workflow, you want it to be as similar today to yesterday as possible, because that way you're going to be sure that whatever the result is the correct one. So in that sense, they were sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of the challenge, because it was, let's say, more straightforward to build systems that support that. And there was more immediate added value, because it was very clear how much costs there were involved with assessing samples and so on. So in that sense, the electronic lab notebooks have been around for quite some time, but we see, let's say in the recent years, we see a new generation of electronic lab notebooks, which is targeting more the R&D environments. So both academic institutions, as well as smaller biotech, pharma, small CRO companies, etc., who have different workflows and find this older generation of software more clunky, if you will. Now, if we look at the comparison between the academic needs and let's say industrial needs, as long as we're talking about R&D, the feature set that is required is very similar, although reasons why somebody would choose on one or the other side of the industry, why they would choose an ELN are somewhat different. So maybe when in academia, the main value that scientists get from using an ELN is really to be able to build upon knowledge, to make sure that data is stored in a fair way, if you will, so that the data can be the data is findable, reproducible, etc. Basically, as a you as a researcher, one of the most important things, so why you wake up and why you go to work, is that the work you're doing will have a small impact in the total research landscape, but it will have an impact. And the only way to do that is if your research can be connected to the whole ecosystem of research that is done, and the results and the data that you've produced can be built upon by others.
Yes.
So this is something where we see is the value coming from academia, whereas with industry, of course, this is also important, but it's an element of saving time is equally, if not more important as well, because they are more cost driven. But in the sense of features, it's very, very similar. We have a couple of features that we thought are only for academia, but let's say one of the classic example is, I guess we'll get to AI later, but we have the AI manuscript writer, which we thought, oh, that will be a great tool for academics because it will save them some time when they're writing a scientific paper. What we've seen is that also mid to large size companies that are publishing almost no scientific papers, they find this feature very interesting because internally they do reporting on discoveries very similar to how scientists would report, so in a form of a scientific paper. So again, they are incentivized to cut time, and therefore they saw value in that as well. So there are a few other examples like this, but it's hard to separate ELNs in terms of academia and industry. I think it makes more sense to separate them if you have the very standardized workflow versus having a very flexible workflow. And this is where new tools that have a lot more flexibility, smartness, if you will, so tools that can anticipate what you will do, automatically annotate data with the relevant data, etc. This is what's sort of picking up. In terms of, what are we doing that will, as a community of products that will make this easier? Well, for one thing, we are still in the phase where we are trying to figure it out, to be honest. We are working with our scientists very closely, trying to help them understand, help us learn what we should do as a vendor as well. And I think from the competitors that I've met, they all see it in a very similar way. And even though we are competitors, our biggest competitor is the force of habit. And we are sort of struggling together and trying to figure out together. By together, I also mean scientific community, how to tackle this challenge. And it will take a lot of effort on our vendors, on us vendors, to make products that fit the purpose, but also on the scientific community to realize that there are changes that are needed and basically implement digital strategies as part of their core processes.
So yours is not a mature industry at this point. It's still emerging in a way, at least in terms of ELNs.
Yes, in terms of ELNs, it's definitely emerging. We estimate that only about 10% of labs have a digital strategy, digital way of digital systematic way of capturing data. This is actually quite difficult to estimate because, if I type everything in a Word document and store that on Dropbox, arguably I have a cloud-based electronic lab notebook. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a lab notebook that is implemented organization-wide, even if this means just one lab, but that one team that is sort of achieving same goals is using the same system in a way to make them more efficient, but also in a way that their data will be stored in a sustainable way for the future as well.
And it strikes me that, again, that there's a generation of researchers who've come out maybe in the last 20 years for whom disciplinary boundaries are not terribly important. As you say, they're doing work in almost every field. So once again, it's still not a mature industry from the point of view of selling products and services. When I was getting ready for today's interview, I came across a really fascinating article in a March 11th, 2019 issue of Quantum magazine by Dan Falk. And he wrote about how AI, artificial intelligence, is changing science. And it begins with the recognition that in fields such as physics and astronomy, research is producing huge amounts of information, way too much for anyone to keep up with the data. Historically, science involved observation or simulation, but in Falk's words, the latest techniques in machine learning and AI represent a fundamentally new way of doing science. And here I'm going to quote, "One such approach, known as generative modeling, can help identify the most plausible theory among competing explanations for observational data, based solely on the data, and importantly, without any pre-programmed knowledge of what physical processes might be at work in the system that's under study." Proponents of generative modeling see it as novel enough to be considered a potential third way of learning about the universe. He gives an example of how generative modeling works. Falk says, think of what your brain might be doing when you try to determine the gender of a human face. Perhaps you notice hairstyle, nose shape, and so on, as well as patterns you can't easily put into words. The computer program is similarly looking for salient features among data. And though it has no idea what a mustache is or what gender is, if it's been trained on data sets in which some images are tagged man or woman, and in which some have a mustache tag, it will quickly deduce a connection. How do you see AI fitting into a type of science not done by observation or simulation, but something akin to generative modeling? What would such an approach mean for Scinote?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'll try to answer it coherently. So there is a lot of, let's say, there is a lot of power that can come from algorithms, not just AI, but any type of, let's say, modern, or not necessarily modern algorithms, but just the fact that we have the computing capabilities, computing powers, the servers that we never had before. It's a tremendous power that we are underusing at this point to really generate knowledge, to generate understanding. So in that sense, I completely agree with the author. There's a lot of things that, let's say, that can be applied to scientific data sets and generate knowledge from. Now, before we get to that, what all of these algorithms have in common, that they need large, or ideally as large as possible, data sets to learn from. Right? The larger the data set, the better the algorithm. Which is really difficult to do in science right now, because when I do my experiment, it's going to be my Excel spreadsheet. When you do yours, it's going to be your Excel spreadsheet. And until somebody comes along that will put those two spreadsheets in a single spreadsheet, then we're not going to have that large, holistic data set for any of these algorithms to learn. So what I see before that, and there's also a potential for a lot of these smart algorithms, is really how we consolidate data. And there's another thing. So let's say that we're both measuring glucose in blood of our patients. So I might do it as a time series. So I'll do it one today, one tomorrow, one the week after. You might do it as a time series, in the single day, and somebody else is maybe interesting just in the morning samples. So even though we're all very interested in measuring blood glucose, we can't simply put all the data in a single spreadsheet.
Exactly.
Now, that doesn't mean that our all data combined wouldn't be interested for a certain analysis. Maybe for certain analysis, when we're just looking at, I don't know, a correlation between blood glucose levels and gender, if you will, then then all of these results will matter. But if we're looking, only how does fasting influence blood glucose, then we have to be very, very careful which of the data points we can select. And maybe I, that was doing the time series, I don't even have the data about fasting and so on.
Exactly.
So where I see, before we can really leverage the power of this huge amount of data that is generated in science, we need to figure out a way how can we merge this data together. And a lot of this has been done on multiple angles. One is something that we also at Scinote support with all our hearts, is making sure data is fair. So FAIR is the acronym, which is now becoming very popular. Basically, it's a set of guidelines how to make sure that others can build on top of your data. What's the minimal information required that you store about that? And what we see as our role in Scinote is to enable this and automate this as much as possible. And coming back to my original statement, I think there is a lot of potential here for these smart algorithms to sort of help us merge this data together on a database level, without scientists' need, but scientists can then come in, and the AI, or whatever you want to call that algorithm, sort of shows to the scientists, look, this is what I was reasoning, this is how I saw that these two things connect, do you agree? So it cannot be a black box AI that just produces something and we don't know how. So I think this is an important difference. But having said that, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and this is something we should tackle first.
It also strikes me that actually encourages even more a collaborative approach, as you pointed out, as you projected into the future, the extraordinary expansion of collaborative work. That's precisely what you'd be doing using the rules of FAIR.
Yep, exactly.
Well, Klemen, we're almost out of time, but we always like to have our guests leave behind something that he'd like a listener to remember from this. Do you have one or two for us?
Yes, absolutely. So maybe my first take-home message would be that we are relying a lot on science to deliver for the future. There are challenges that we are facing as a planet, as a community, that arguably were caused by scientific advancements, but can only be solved by us doing extraordinary scientific achievements, not individuals, but as communities. And as communities of scientists and communities of scientific vendors as well. So that's maybe the first thing, that we need to make changes in how we do science, and we need to make them as soon as possible. The time is running out. Now, the second take-home message would be that there's not going to be a magic bullet for this. It's going to be everybody coming together as a community. We'll have to talk a lot between the vendors, between the scientists. We'll have to integrate tools to work with one another. And most importantly, we'll have to start by changing the mindset that, just doing science for the sake of publishing a paper, for doing an experiment, for getting that one Excel spreadsheet is not enough. It's at least equally important to think about and to manage whatever we've researched. How is this going to live in a sustainable way so that others can build upon our existing scientific discoveries?
That is a perfect end to today's particular interview. I want to thank you very, very much for being with us here on Innovators. And I hope we'll have a chance to come back in maybe a year or so and see whether some of those projections of yours have begun taking form, because I think you've touched on something that goes back to the early part of the 20th century, when physicists were working across national borders and boundaries at a time that it was still very difficult in some cases for you to move people and goods across national boundaries. So that capacity remains a key to scientific progress. So thank you very much for being with us on Innovators.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for all the great work you're doing at Innovators.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.